All she asked for was some leftover food, but what her boss discovered that night would shake him to his core. Brian Thompson, the CEO of a successful hospitality company, had reviewed thousands of employee requests in his career time off forms, shift swaps, payroll clarifications. But that night, long after his executive team had left, one peculiar request made him stop cold. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even bold. It was quiet, almost shy. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? The name on the request, Emily Parker, a 24-year-old line cook. No disciplinary record. No complaints. Always punctual. Always among the last to leave. Brian stared at the screen. It wasn't unusual for employees to casually ask managers for extra food, but few ever put it in writing formally. Why did she feel the need to? Why so official? He typed her name into the employee database. No listed emergency contacts. No spouse. No family. That was unusual. Maybe she was just frugal. But something about her tone didn't say budgeting, it said need. Real quiet, desperate need. Brian wasn't the sentimental type. He dealt in numbers and strategy. But this request, it stirred something. A question kept echoing in his mind. Why would someone working full-time in my company be worried about leftover food? And so, without telling anyone, Brian grabbed his coat and headed out into the cold night. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but what he did find would change everything. Brian stood in the shadows of the dimly lit parking lot, watching through the kitchen's back door as Emily scrubbed down the final countertop. Her movements were swift, mechanical, clearly shaped by long, exhausting shifts. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, strands clinging to her damp forehead from the heat of the grill. A shift manager handed her a brown paper bag, presumably the leftovers she had requested. Emily nodded politely, tucked it under her arm, and unhooked her worn backpack from a nail in the wall. She didn't linger. With the same quiet efficiency she showed on the clock, Emily walked down the street toward the bus stop. Brian hesitated before climbing into his black sedan and slowly pulling out, maintaining a distance. Something inside him compelled him to follow, though he still didn't fully understand what he was doing. Was this even appropriate? But that small request had planted a seed of unease he couldn't shake. The city passed by in a blur as the bus Emily boarded made its way further from downtown. Bright storefronts gave way to boarded-up windows. Streetlights grew sparse. Nearly an hour later, Emily finally pulled the yellow cord and stepped off in a worn-out part of town. Brian kept driving slowly, carefully following her at a distance. Then she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of old, rusted cars. Brian parked and stepped out. What he saw next hit harder than any boardroom decision he'd ever made. Emily wasn't walking into an apartment, or even a modest house. She was unlocking the flimsy door of a deteriorating trailer, the kind of place people ended up in, not chose to live in. As she stepped inside, a small light flickered on through the stained curtains. Brian felt the weight of it hit him. This was one of his own employees, full-time, dependable, and this was where she came home to. And that wasn't even the worst part. From his car parked discreetly down the street, Brian watched through the trailer's dim, flickering window. At first, all he saw was Emily setting the brown paper bag on the counter, but within seconds, 3 small children ran from the shadows and wrapped their arms around her waist. Their faces lit up with joy, voices rising with excitement. Brian froze. These weren't her children, he could tell. They looked too young. Siblings, maybe? Then came an older woman, hunched and frail, her steps slow and uncertain. Emily gently helped her into a worn recliner and placed a hand on her shoulder. The connection between them was unmistakable. A grandmother, perhaps, a caretaker's tenderness in every movement. Brian's heart tightened as Emily began dividing the food. 4 plates, not 5. She dished out small portions with practiced precision, making sure the kids ate first. The older woman followed her hands, trembling slightly as she lifted her fork. Emily, she just smiled, nodded, and pushed food around on her plate, never once bringing a bite to her lips. She was pretending to eat. Brian leaned forward, the scene cutting deep. Emily had worked a grueling double shift, yet here she was skipping dinner so the rest of her family could eat. This wasn't budgeting. This wasn't cutting corners. This was survival. Sacrifice. He thought about the meal he'd had earlier that night, perfectly seared steak at a high-end restaurant, barely touched half of it, tossed without a second thought. The contrast made him feel ill. In that moment, it hit him. Emily wasn't just struggling. She was carrying the weight of an entire family, alone, quietly, invisibly. And he had never noticed. Brian sat motionless, the hum of his car barely audible under the weight of what he had just witnessed. Inside the trailer, the kids finished eating and stretched their small bodies, clearly used to sharing cramped quarters. The older woman shuffled slowly toward the recliner, clearly her makeshift bed. Emily quietly cleaned up, gathering the empty plates, her steps heavy but careful not to wake anyone. Then Brian saw it tucked near the corner of the kitchenette, beside a folded chair and a stack of worn blankets, a thin mattress barely more than foam on the floor. That was her bed. No privacy, no door, not even a couch. After standing on her feet all day, she came home to sleep on the floor in the corner of a drafty trailer. The realization landed like a punch. Brian had built his company on the promise of family values. He had sat in meetings boasting about employee perks and retention rates, sipping lattes in leather chairs that cost more than Emily's monthly income. He had approved policies without question, had signed off on bonuses for executives while people like Emily sacrificed meals for their families. His jaw clenched. His company had failed her not because it was underpaying her in numbers alone, but because it was blind to her reality. And suddenly he was done just feeling bad. Brian didn't drive home that night. He stayed parked, staring at the dark trailer fists tightening around the steering wheel. This wasn't charity she needed. It was justice, dignity, a fair chance. And if no one else was going to fix it, he would. Not tomorrow, not next quarter. Now. The next morning, Brian walked into headquarters not as a CEO protecting quarterly profits, but as a man on a mission. By noon, sweeping changes were already underway. The first policy to go, the unspoken rule about leftover food. From now on, all excess meals would be packaged and offered freely to staff. No requests, no shame, no paperwork. Just dignity. But he didn't stop there. Brian ordered a full review of employee wages, beginning with hourly workers like Emily. Within hours, salaries were restructured to ensure no full-time employee would ever have to choose between groceries and rent again. A new emergency assistance fund was launched, one designed to help team members facing unexpected hardships like medical bills or housing instability. And for Emily, she walked into work that afternoon, unaware of any of it until her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside, a raise large enough to lift her and her family out of that trailer. Enough to afford an apartment with real bedrooms, a real bed, and maybe finally meals she didn't have to pretend to eat. Emily didn't cry. She just stared at the letter for a long moment, then smiled a soft, tired smile that said, "Maybe now I can breathe." Brian watched from its hallway, unnoticed. He didn't want applause. This wasn't about optics or brand. It was about finally doing what should have been done long ago, seeing people. Because real leadership, he realized, isn't measured by profit margins. It's measured by how you respond when you finally see what's been hidden in plain sight all along. For the first time in months, Emily walked home, with her head held high, not from exhaustion, but from relief. That night, she didn't pretend to eat. She sat at the table with her siblings and grandmother and joined them fork in hand, laughter on her lips, and real food on her plate. The kids noticed immediately. "You're eating with us tonight?" one of them asked, eyes wide. Emily just nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Yeah," she whispered. "Tonight I can." Meanwhile, in a corner office across town, Brian sat quietly at his desk. He wasn't drafting reports or prepping for board meetings. He was reflecting. One quiet employee with one simple request had exposed the blind spot in his entire organization, and now he couldn't look away. He wouldn't. Because leadership isn't about how high you rise, it's about how deeply you care. In the weeks that followed, change swept through the company like a quiet storm. Other employees, once too proud or too scared to speak up, found the courage to share their own struggles. Some had sick parents, others were behind on rent. A few were working 2 jobs just to survive. But now they weren't alone. The new policies didn't just ease their burdens, they restored their dignity. As for Emily, life slowly began to shift. She found a small, clean apartment with 2 bedrooms and space enough for her family to breathe. The kids had a real table to do their homework. Her grandmother had a proper bed. And Emily, she no longer had to skip meals or fake smiles. She even began taking classes at the local community college on weekends, something she had once only dreamed about. And Brian, he kept his promise. He visited store locations regularly. He asked questions. He listened. But more importantly, he acted. His company culture changed, not from a PR campaign, but from one moment of truth that started with a humble request for leftover food. That moment became a mirror not just for Brian, but for all of us. Months later, Emily was promoted to kitchen supervisor. She no longer walked to the bus stop with sore feet and an empty stomach. She drove herself home. Her head still held high, but now with a sense of purpose. Her life hadn't just changed, it had been restored. And it all started with one brave request and one CEO who chose to pay attention. Brian would later say, "That night didn't just make me a better leader, it made me a better man." In a world where so many people are silently struggling, it's easy to overlook the quiet ones, the ones who never complain, never ask for more, and never stop giving. But just because someone doesn't speak up doesn't mean they're not hurting. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between speaking up and staying silent? What would you do if you were in Brian's shoes or Emily's? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that just might open your heart or change your perspective.